right, welcome to the UrbanLogiq Podcast. This is episode 2, and this is a timely one. We just came out of a federal election. The Liberals were elected for a 4th term. So we want to understand what the future might mean in terms of innovation, AI, and policy. Of course, we're GovTech, so this is very relevant to us. We are here with Mark Masongsong. He is the co-founder and CEO of UrbanLogiq, and he brings a very unique lens to this conversation. Mark, before you founded UrbanLogiq in 2016, you worked in politics, so you have a very deep understanding of how policy is shaped.
That's right.
I want to just kind of dive right in. First of all, I want to just get your initial thoughts on a Liberal win. Are you feeling hopeful for the future of innovation in this country as a founder trying to scale a tech company right here in Canada?
Well, I think anyone who's been following politics in Canada, I think we're all still dealing with the shock of a very wild swing back and forth. And so I think the first reaction is anything really can happen. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when it comes to making projections of what's going to happen in the next few years. If things can change as much as they have in the past few months, for those who were not following it, it was looking like it was going to go in a massive direction towards a conservative government, and then almost at the last minute it swung to the Liberals under a new leader. And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind is things can swing back and forth, and I think that we have to prepare for the next few years a world of turbulence. I think that's the main thing that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you're a founder of a Canadian company, as I mentioned. We are headquartered here in Vancouver. We are trying to grow. We're trying to scale here in Canada. What does the government need to do to keep that homegrown innovation here at home?
So I think we do certain things well. We have a strong education base. We are a country of immigrants, so we can recruit some of the best talent from anywhere in the world. And we do a good job, I think, of integrating different skill sets and different diverse cultures together. So I think that's what we do well. The problem is, I think, sometimes governments will point to our strengths and pay more attention to that than areas where we're maybe perhaps need to do more work and be more honest with ourselves about why do we have all this talent, and we effectively become a farm system for the American tech community. We create technologies here in Canada, and once it matures, it moves to the United States. And I think that the common response of politicians is to point out, but we have strong universities, we have strong research and development, we have a global culture. If anything, that should raise a question. So why isn't it working as well as it can? And I think that what we need to be doing now is using this moment of turbulence in the geopolitical and international realm to give ourselves a hard look and say, what changes do we have to make? There are certain things that governments can do, but also the solution can't always be the government needs to fund more subsidies. Because I think that's oftentimes a crutch that we use in Canada is that if we're not working well in a certain economy, the government needs to pour more money into it. And oftentimes that can lead to poorly thought out incentives and poor business discipline, when maybe the thing that we need to do is figure out what do we need to do to make Canadian companies really more competitive and less reliant on government handouts.
It's almost a culture shift that needs to happen. I think there's a very stark difference between kind of that culture of innovation and risk and trying new things in the US versus in Canada, where we're a little bit more stay in our lane and play it safe.
I think that's exactly right. And we experienced this in UrbanLogiq, where when we were, fundraising here in Canada, a lot of Canadian investors were, maybe when you have a little more experience, when you're a little bit bigger, you have more revenue, then we'll invest in you. Then you go down to Silicon Valley, and they're very willing to take a flyer on a company because in the United States, it's more natural instinct to take a big risk and swing for, the fences on a company that hasn't proven anything yet, but they're aiming for something big. And I think that is a culture that will need to be brought to Canada. And sometimes I wonder if government subsidies prevent that incentive from coming in, because a lot of investors are saying, well, why would we invest when the government maybe should be funding this?
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings me to Mark Carney was really elected as the guy to battle Donald Trump. That was, I think, the main issue that really convinced Canadians that he was the guy to lead our country. And, historically, especially us doing business in the GovTech, of course, Canadian governments are less keen on trying new things. We have an easier time selling to governments in the US. Most of our clients are US governments. With this trade war that we are now effectively in with the United States, we are starting to see kind of a shift in tides where companies are now reaching out to us here at home saying, we want to buy Canadian. How can we buy Canadian? How do we keep this momentum? What do you think needs to continue to keep fostering that support here at home for Canadian innovation? Because we're not short of it.
That's right. I mean, a lot of the biggest breakthroughs in artificial intelligence were birthed, in the University of Toronto and in Montreal and right here in Canada. But they're developed in Canada, but then they're adopted in the United States. And I think we experience that quite a bit. We'll oftentimes develop technology here in Vancouver, and we'll announce it, demo it, and then the first buyers are in, whether Texas or Europe or overseas, before, oftentimes the Canadian governments feel comfortable. There's, I think, an understandable culture in government where, because you're dealing with tax dollars and public safety, there's a respectable need to play it safe. However, there's a other angle to that, which is when you're a Canadian company, you're developing technologies, and you realize that if you really want to be innovative, you have to leave Canada. That can have a long-term negative effect where Canada loses its economic sovereignty because the proprietary intellectual property from Canada has to grow elsewhere. And I think that there are ways that you can look at how other governments have managed innovation properly. I think the Startup in Residence program in San Francisco is a great example, where what they did is they carved out a special project where government was given permission to take risks, and it was firewalled in a sense where, in case it went sideways, it wouldn't bring down the government. So if you want to be innovative and you want to do it in a safe way, there are examples, but there has to be a decision that at the highest level of government, we want to use the government as a test bed for innovation. And I think if the Canadian government wants to advance innovation here in Canada, maybe it's a little bit less about providing subsidies and more about carving out a space where we're going to procure things that are on the bleeding edge, and we're going to be comfortable with the fact that some of it will not work. Innovation and failure are two sides of the same coin. And if you want innovation, you have to have a risk tolerance that some of this will go wrong. And we knew that going in, and we were okay with that because the upside of us developing a breakthrough is going to be worth it in the long run.
Yeah, so during the election, I think a lot of people pointed to Mark Carney spending so much time in the U.S. as maybe a negative. Why are we electing somebody that hasn't even been living here or paying taxes for the past decade? But now, to your point, when we're trying to take notes from the U.S. about how they grow innovation in the United States and keep it there, perhaps this is actually going to work in our benefit that he has spent so much time south of the border.
Yeah, I think we're in a potential crisis, and in times like this, it's less important to be about the performative signaling of things like that. And at the end of the day, wherever the best idea comes from, and if the best idea had to be born of someone who developed global experience, we should take it. We shouldn't. I think that we should be serious in a serious moment and just say, if it's a good idea, really don't care where he got it from, where the experience came from. All that matters, all that should be measured on, is this a good idea and can he execute on it?
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with us copying the U.S. on certain things, that's for sure. So when we talk about the Canada Strong platform, there's specific wording in there that talks about really positioning Canada as a global leader in AI. From your perspective, what do you think needs to happen to really position us strongly?
Well, Canada has been the leader in AI. If you look at the breakthroughs in deep learning with Geoffrey Hinton and the like, those came from Canada. There was a window in time where Canada had a near monopoly on the world's greatest AI talent, and then for the reasons we talked about, Canadians are not adopters of innovation, so we might be the inventors of it, but we're not the adopters. And I think maybe the lesson should be learned about that. Why did Geoffrey Hinton and all of his acolytes have to move to the United States in order to see their work flourish? And so I think that's where we should look at the things we do well. We do fundamental research well. Geoffrey Hinton was also an immigrant, and so we took immigrants from overseas, brought them and educated them at great universities, funded fundamental research, and that led to great breakthroughs. Up to that point, we've done great. It's the next step where I think we stumbled as a country. And I think that is a culture of risk aversion. So I think, again, like on all the government-funded sides, up to that point went well. It came to time for the private sector to adopt this and maybe operational levels of government to adopt this where we waited for the Americans to do it first. And by the time we got it, we were buying Canadian invented products from American companies. And maybe the solution here is for us to look at, let's stop congratulating ourselves on being inventors, and we should put ourselves to a higher standard around what would it take for us to adopt things. And I think that is an area where if you pay attention to a problem, I think you'll find solutions. But I think a lot of fanfare goes to the invention side of it, when really the value and the growth of technology happens when it's adopted. And I think that's the area where, as a culture, we generally are slow adopters.
Yeah, we're inventors. We also need to be implementers.
Yes.
And we need to stop letting the U.S. take credit for all our work.
Well, I mean, to give credit to the Americans, sometimes it's a brave thing to try something new. And I think we have a number of government partners who I will always admire and have deep respect for them, because the safe thing is to hire one of the big four firms or go with one of the big tech companies. But when they feel that their citizens' needs aren't being met, and they talk to us and they get the sense that maybe UrbanLogiq could pull this off, it's a big risk for them to take a leap of faith on a new and small company, but they're willing to do that because they believe the upside for their citizens is worth it. And I think that is something to be commended, and it's sometimes disappointing that you have that type of leadership as a culture, as a more acceptable, normal thing in the United States. We definitely have that here in Canada. We have some very forward-thinking communities. I'm thinking like Nanaimo, for example.
I was going to say Nanaimo, yeah.
Exactly. Like that, there are some of the most forward-thinking, public servants. But in the United States, it is almost, it's almost an accepted part of a lot of the culture there, where trying something new and buying from a tiny startup is not really that big a deal. And in Canada, I think it is something where it is more of a rare event.
We need to take more risks here in Canada.
Yes, and also we need to not punish governments when risks go sideways. Because I think that's part of what leads to bureaucracy is someone will take a risk, it will go sideways, and then they'll layer several layers of controls to make sure this never happens again. Definitely certain things should not happen. And when there's, waste, fraud, and abuse, there should be controls to prevent that. However, a well-meaning attempt to try something new that doesn't work out is not something that you should create rules against so you prevent that from happening. Because I think that's part of the problem is governments oftentimes say, let's try to be innovative, but let's make sure that the company that is doing it has proven experience in this field, et cetera, or they're a large company and they've got plenty of resources. Because when you try to minimize risk, you limit the potential of innovation.
For sure. And that brings me it's a really good segue to my next point here. In the Liberal platform, they do outline $28 billion in savings by 2028, 2029, mainly through cutting the reliance on consultants, as you mentioned. Maybe we stop funneling all the contracts to the big four, consolidating programs and really shrinking the size of government. Under Trudeau, it grew 43%, which was famously outpacing Canada's population during that same time. I think it might seem far-fetched to a lot of people when they look at that number, but working in GovTech, we understand where the possibilities are and how much more efficient governments can be through the use of technology and innovation. So I want to hear from you. How do you see the path forward about where we can find those savings and maybe even more?
Well, first of all, I've heard a lot of media comments about how it's $20 billion is a big claim to make, and it's very hard to imagine that being possible. The government's going to spend $500 billion. The federal government's going to spend over $500 billion. $28 billion of savings is a reasonable thing especially when you look at the pace of technology advancing. So, and this is not a hypothetical, they're concrete examples. We work with one of our partner communities, and they shrunk a permitting process from 6 months to 3 days using artificial intelligence. And if you think of the human savings in terms of hours spent on that, generally we oftentimes, we work with the province of British Columbia, and there's a process we work with them, again, to shrink a process that could take 2 to 4 years and shrink that down to days or weeks. And these, I would say, are just the tip of the iceberg. This was technology that we'd worked with years ago, and if you follow the pace of where AI is going, it's orders of magnitude more powerful every few months. And I think the opportunity to radically make governments, and I mean radically, more efficient is doable with technology today. It's not a technology problem. It's not that we don't know where to apply it. I think this is going to be a leadership and a willingness problem, because you can go to the government and I think ourselves or most other companies in the space can point out, here's how you can save 28, 50 or more billion annually consistently without reducing the quality of service. This is doable today with technology that we have and many others have. The problem is that you would have to make a decision at the government that you're willing to make changes and change the way things have been done. And I think that's oftentimes the harder part.
Yeah, I mean, it's a core part of our mission at UrbanLogiq to really help governments make the best use of their data, their workforce, their resources by making them more efficient with the use of technology. So I guess my question is the government being ambitious enough? Should they shoot for higher, more savings within government?
Short answer is yes, but I think it's not a bad plan to put out a concrete target that already I think will make people question if it's possible. And the key thing is less the first target and more what they do with it. I think I think the government should be more ambitious, but what they can do, I think, is execute well on this first step. And I think that will earn the confidence of the public when they see that governments have gotten leaner, more efficient, more productive, and yet the quality of service actually improves. And it's more fair and it's more transparent. At that point, I think they will earn the confidence of the public to then say, well, now we want to take this to the next level. So I think I think if it was us running things, we would have made a more ambitious target. But I think the more important thing is what they do with their first target.
Also in the platform, they talk about, continued investment in responsible AI. And responsible AI, again, is a really core component of what we do here at UrbanLogiq. So what does responsible AI mean to you? And what do you think that looks like in terms of the federal government kind of really focusing on that?
AI is a very powerful tool, and it is also a very immature tool. So I think responsible AI is about creating the right frameworks and safeguards in place that you get the benefits of AI while making sure that you mitigate and eliminate the downsides to the degree that you can. Again, flagging that this is new and there will be learning pains. So in a concrete example, I think making sure that you have AI deployments that are transparent, that are values-based, and that you define in advance what it means for success and what it means for danger. So, for example, making sure that AI isn't biased in its training and its implementation, making sure that it cannot be abused. So you identify certain use cases where you are uncomfortable giving up human control, and also where you identify, and I think this is a bigger part that is not being talked about enough in electoral politics right now, is these huge advancements and huge savings are going to come at the expense of some people. I don't think that can be avoided, but you do then need to think about what are we going to do to make sure that we have a fair and compassionate treatment for people. Like when you save billions of dollars, there will be a shrinkage in government. I think we should be honest with each other. That is what it will take to balance the budget, to do things more efficiently, and that means certain people may find themselves out of work. And I think this is going to happen across the economy. The government is actually, I think, just a small fraction of this. Are we talking about harnessing these benefits of AIs and then channeling them in a way that there are compassionate off-ramps for people that they then need to be directed into the next stage of their careers and lives? Now the election is over, we need to have a more serious discussion about this.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question. How do you balance, really allowing innovation to grow and prosper and also putting in the right regulatory guardrails in place for AI?
So on the regulatory guardrails, I think that we can look at other jurisdictions, the European, South Korea, and others, where they've started to, and even in Canada, where we started to say, how would you govern this? And I think the UrbanLogiq position is it's very difficult and might be a fool's errand to try to prescriptively say, here is what the AI should look like. It may make more sense to do two things. Number one, define what you're not allowed to do. So don't punish or don't control the algorithm, but identify the behavior that you want to ban. And I think the Europeans have structured it something like this, where depending on the level of risk of a use case. There's escalating degrees of control. So I think something like that, something that is tailored, depending on how dangerous a potential algorithm would be, you have more strict controls on it. And so I think some structure around that is in a risk or a risk-based control mechanism. I think a second part is to have the developers of AI at the table. So one of the governments who work with the United States, they were very eager to get the benefits of AI, but they also realized they didn't understand how a lot of this worked. And so in the contract with them, they put in controls where we are obligated to educate their public servants on how AI works. And they actually brought in panels of outside experts and community representatives. And so on a regular basis, we would have to educate both members of the community on how AI works and what we're doing with it. And they would give feedback around, I'm not comfortable with you doing that. And then at the same time, when we would present an algorithm, a panel of experts would query us in front of an audience of the public servants. And so that was where they got an education. And so they weren't just told hand over the keys to a company. So I think those types of innovative, creative structures can lead to a knowledge transfer from the technology companies building this into the minds of the public servants. So I think there's an aspect of that would allow the governments to, you can't control what you don't understand. And none of this stuff is beyond the understanding of most public servants. Most public servants we work with are educated, dedicated, hardworking people. And I think that there should be a mandated knowledge transfer where if the governments are going to harness AI, they should be taught on how it's working.